beneath the blazing red sky of Dust Haven. 1884, a stagecoach came to a stop in the middle of a laughing crowd. Inside sat Eleanor Wade. 33 years old, the so-called old maid of the town, a woman her own family had forced onto the widowed rancher Caleb Rowan as part of a cruel joke. They told him, "Go on, take her. Think of it as charity." But when Eleanor stepped down, standing tall amid the dust and the mocking eyes, Caleb didn't see someone unwanted. He saw the only woman left who still carried her dignity in a world gone dry and mean. If it were you, after 15 long years of being forgotten, would you have the courage to walk into the home that once belonged to your broken dream? Would you dare to face the man who once meant everything, and the whole town waiting for you to fail, out here on the harsh frontier? Love doesn't arrive by miracle. It's built through patience, grit, and the choice never to back down. And that cruel joke on that dusty afternoon became the beginning of a story that would make an entire town bow its head. If you believe love can find its way back, no matter how late, hit, like, share, and subscribe to Frontier Hearts, and join me on the journey of Eleanor and Caleb across a West full of storms, dust, and quiet grace. That morning, the prairie wind carried the scent of faraway rain and the faint smoke of early fires. At the edge of Willow Bend, folks gathered outside the post office, buzzing with laughter around a dust-caked stagecoach. No one came expecting kindness, they came for a spectacle, the kind of cruel amusement that small towns often feed on to make the day go faster. On the back of that coach sat Ada Whitmore, her hands gripping the hem of her faded gray dress as if it were the last thread of pride she had left. 32 years old, survivor of 10 hard winters. She'd once run a small homestead on her own until the bank took it away. Folks called her an old maid, like it was a sentence, not just a name. And today, rumor had it, she was being handed over to a widowed rancher down by Dry Creek like a worn-out piece of property no one else wanted to claim. The coach rolled to a stop at high noon. The sun poured down, turning dust into blinding gold. Laughter broke around her like glass, sharp and careless. The wagon hit a rut as it turned up the dirt road leading to Rowe Ranch, where Gideon Rowe had lived alone for over a decade since his wife's passing. They said Gideon was hard as stone, that grief had dried out his heart. But they also said one thing more: Rowe Ranch still stood because the man who ran it knew how to endure. When the wheels finally stilled, the men who'd escorted the coach broke into rowdy laughter. "Hey, Gideon, heard you needed a cook. We brought you one fresh from the discount pile." Their laughter echoed down the valley, dull and cutting. Ada didn't flinch. She stepped down slowly, her worn boots sinking into the soft dirt. A gust of wind swept through, lifting strands of her dust-streaked brown hair. She lifted her chin not toward the jeering crowd, but toward the man standing on the porch. His shadow stretched long across the sun-baked ground. Gideon Rowe, tall, broad-shouldered, eyes dark as the river in flood season. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, silent, watching the woman they'd brought him as a joke. And in that still moment, the laughter, the hoarse snorts, even the wind seemed to fade until only two people remained in the world, the man and the woman who both knew what loneliness felt like. And Gideon saw in her eyes not shame but hope, a strange kind of hope, thin as thread but tough as rawhide. It made him breathe deeper, made the air around him feel too real, too alive. The laughter picked up again. Someone called out, "Careful, Rowe." She might drag you to a wedding before she cooks you dinner. Ada kept her back straight. Her voice, when it came, was calm and steady so much so that even the wind seemed to pause to listen. I didn't come here for pity. I came for work and for a roof that respects the people under it. The crowd went silent. Gideon's brow furrowed, but then his gaze softened like a memory had just stepped out of the shadows. 17 years ago, when he'd been just a poor young man building his first cabin, he'd once stood before a girl and promised, "I'll make something you can be proud of." That girl had never come back, and the name Ada Whitmore had been written in one of his unsent letters for years. Now she stood before him not the same young girl, but with the same eyes he'd never forgotten. Gideon stepped down from the porch. His voice came low and steady. "If you came to work, you've got work, and if someone sent you here to make a fool of me, they picked the wrong man." Ada bowed her head slightly. She said nothing more, but the faint curve of her lips, small as a breath, carried more truth than any words could. Behind them, the men turned their horses, disappointed that their fun had ended too soon. Their laughter faded with the clatter of hooves, leaving behind only drifting dust and the hum of the afternoon. As the gate of Rowe Ranch swung shut, Ada glanced back over her shoulder, eyes catching the last light of the setting sun. "At least they can't say I didn't walk through the door." Gideon nodded once. "You did, and that says more than any of them ever could." In that moment, neither of them knew that the town's cruel joke would soon become the story all of Wyoming would remember. The first night at Rowe Ranch passed in a silence so heavy it felt alive. Ada Whitmore lay on a rough wooden bed, listening to the prairie wind scrape across the porch and the creak of floorboards whenever Gideon Rowe walked through the sitting room. Neither of them had spoken since the crowd rode off and the gate had swung shut. But silence wasn't emptiness, it was the breath of memory, thick enough that each could almost hear the echo of their own heartbeat, carrying back through the years. Outside, the June moon rose late, casting silver across the grass still wet with dew. Gideon sat on the porch, a cold cup of coffee in his hand. Inside, Ada opened an old kitchen cabinet and traced her fingers over a faint carving, Boyu, her own initials, carved into the wood 15 years ago, back when the world still felt young enough for dreams. 15 years earlier, in the same town of Willow Bend, Ada had been 17, her chestnut hair catching the prairie light, her hands always sticky with pine sap from helping her father mend fences. Gideon, 24 then, was a blacksmith's son with nothing to his name but strength and stubborn hope. He worked for the Whitmore family, tending their stock and fixing their gates. Their affection hadn't begun with promises. It began with morning hellos at the well, with Gideon carrying milk to the stables and Ada leaving him a small bag of warm biscuits on the fence post. Everyone in town noticed and everyone laughed, but the two of them didn't care. Some summers only happen once, and for those two young souls, every shared glance felt big enough to stop the world. Then came the day Mr. Whitmore sent for Gideon. He didn't shout. He simply said, "You're a good man, Rowe. But my daughter can't trade her future for someone with no land and no name." It was meant as a warning. It landed like a hammer. Gideon stood straight, pride burning behind his young eyes. "I'm not asking for pity. One day, you'll regret ever looking down on honest work." Then he left no goodbye, no backward glance. Ada ran after him across the meadow. but all she saw was the trail of dust his horse left behind. After that day, Willow Bend was never the same. The Whitmore house locked its doors earlier each night. Ada was sent away to study at the church school. Gideon, folks said, went south to claim land along Dry Creek. Rumor followed him first that he'd built his own ranch, then that he'd married a widow somewhere out west. When Ada returned home after her mother's death, she found her father older, quieter, and full of unspoken regret. The town called her Miss Whitmore, Old Maid half in pity, half in mockery. She smiled anyway, because deep down, one thing never died, the memory of that last morning by the well, when Gideon had said, "If you ever see a house I built with my own hands, you'll know I built it for you." Now, standing in the kitchen of that very house, his words echoed like an unfinished promise. He had done it. Rowe Ranch stretched across 3 valleys, with new barns and strong horses. But in his eyes tonight, Ada could see something that had never healed. As the oil lamp flickered low, she heard the porch door open. Gideon stepped in, dust still clinging to his coat. "I'll be repairing the east stable at dawn," he said quietly. "If you need anything, say so." She looked up, voice soft but steady. "I don't need anything. I just wanted to ask if you ever regret it." He met her gaze, didn't speak, but the silence between them was thick with meaning. "Finally," Gideon said, "maybe we all regret something. But regret won't take me back 15 years. Ada nodded slowly. "And I," she said, "don't regret loving you, only letting others speak for my heart." A long quiet followed. The wind sighed through the open window, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant rain. Gideon turned away, heading back toward the porch. "It'll be colder tonight," he said over his shoulder. "You should rest." But when he was gone, Ada stayed at the table. Something inside her, that old ache, had softened. It no longer burned. It glowed, gentle and alive, like embers after a long fire. Morning at Rowe Ranch began with the scent of roasted coffee and the whisper of wind through the old window frame. Dawn had not yet chased off the fog, it only draped the wooden fences in a thin glaze of honey-colored light. Gideon Rowe stood on the porch, a tin cup in his hand, watching the woman by the stove. From where he stood, she looked almost small against the wide silence of the house, yet every movement she made was calm, certain, as if she had belonged there all along. Ada Whitmore didn't hesitate. After a long night steeped in unspoken memories, she simply rose, rolled up her sleeves, and lit the fire. She knew every corner of this kitchen where the knives hung, where the sugar was kept, the little curtain covering half the window. Everything was still there, just as it had been 15 years ago. Not because she had ever lived here, but because in her heart, this house had always been waiting. When Gideon stepped inside, Ada turned and smiled. "You haven't changed much," she said softly. "Only your eyes, they've grown deeper." He set his cup down on the table, voice roughened by the morning chill. "And you," he said, "you walk into my house like nothing ever happened." Ada's smile didn't fade. "I've had 15 years to find a reason to come. Gideon, this morning, that reason finally felt clear." He studied her for a long moment. Outside, the sun lifted higher, spilling gold through the window and setting her chestnut hair aglow like burnished copper. For a heartbeat, Gideon couldn't breathe. Too many things had been buried between them: pride, hurt, and a quiet fear that opening his heart again would only lead to loss. But Ada's eyes held no blame. They were calm, steady, like autumn water, and behind that stillness was a strength he had never seen in any other woman. "You can treat me as a stranger if you must," she said, "but I can't pretend you are one. Not after all these years watching this fence grow gray, this window patched over, and the porch light burning at the same hour every night." Gideon frowned, caught off guard. You stayed in Willow Bend?" "Yes," Ada answered. "Every day I walked past the road to Dry Creek. I saw when you mended the east stable, and last winter you planted willows by the fence line." Gideon fell silent. Something tightened in his chest, not from shame, but from something softer. While he'd spent years trying to forget, she had remembered everything, not because she was trapped by the past, but because she'd never stop believing that someday he might need someone who wouldn't let him stand alone. "Ada," he said finally, his voice low, "you don't owe me anything." "I know," she said with a faint smile, "but there are things that, if left unsaid, would mean I owed myself." Light flooded the room, then revealing the crack in the wooden wall, the dust on an old picture frame, and two people who had both traded youth for pride. Ada stepped closer, pouring more coffee into his cup. Steam rose, curling with the faint scent of dry grass drifting in from the open door. "For 15 years, she said, voice even and quiet, "I told myself you were happy. I'd see smoke rising from your chimney at dusk, the porch light still burning, and I'd think, maybe he's found someone else. But this morning, when they dragged me here to laugh, I realized I didn't come for pity or apology. I just needed to see you again, here, in the home you once promised to build for me." Gideon looked up, his gaze met hers, and the distance of 15 years collapsed into a single breath. They were no longer the 17-year-old girl who had cried in the meadow, or the proud young man who'd ridden away. They were older now, worn by time, softened by loss, and because of that, they finally understood the value of having the courage to step inside again. "If I told you," Gideon said quietly, "that I don't know what to do with you being here, what would you do?" "I'd finish making breakfast," Ada replied, smiling, "and wait for you to figure it out. I've already waited 15 years. What's one more day?" The wind stirred across the porch, gentle as breath. Gideon wanted to speak, but words felt too small for the moment. So he sat, took a sip of coffee, and simply watched her move the sure, measured grace of someone who knew exactly where she belonged. Life on the frontier rarely promised much. The land could go dry. A single storm could wipe away a herd, and a man could lose everything overnight. But that morning, as Gideon watched Ada cross the threshold of his home, he realized there was one thing in this world that could endure the quiet faith of that woman. And that faith, fragile as thread, was strong enough to stitch together all the years they had lost. That afternoon, the sky over Willow Bend darkened earlier than usual. A summer storm was rolling in from the direction of Dry Creek, carrying the scent of honeysuckle and damp earth. Ada Whitmore stood alone in the kitchen of Rowe Ranch, her hands absently arranging the spice jars on the wooden shelf. Her fingers trembled when they brushed against a small brown box tucked deep in the corner, something she'd found that morning while tidying up. The hinges were rusted, the wood worn smooth with age. Inside were a few folded papers, and between them, one letter, her own handwriting, the same curves, The same ink strokes from 15 years ago. She opened it carefully. The paper had yellowed, but the words still cut sharp as glass. I understand. Gideon, if you must leave, I won't stop you. I wish you peace. A gust of wind rattled the shutters, making the oil lamp flicker. Ada closed her eyes. That letter, she remembered writing it, or at least believing she had. She'd been told it was her farewell, a note meant to make things easier, to end with grace. Back then, she was 17, still young enough to believe what she was told. Her father had kept her locked inside for weeks after Gideon's last visit, every day. He repeated the same words, "You need to forget him. Ada." He came to me himself, said it's better this way, said you'd only bring shame to his name. That lie had carved itself into her bones. She hadn't dared question it. She'd written what her father told her to write, weeping as she signed her name. She thought it was the only way to keep Gideon's dignity intact and to keep her own heart from breaking completely. Now, under the trembling glow of lamplight, the truth unfurled like a ghost she'd been waiting to meet. Every year of loneliness, every whisper of pity from the townsfolk, all of it had begun with a single lie. Outside, thunder rolled low across the valley. Ada sank into a chair, the letter trembling in her hands. She remembered that afternoon long ago, the last time she'd seen Gideon. He'd stood by the well, thinner than she'd ever known him, eyes hollow from sleepless nights. They hadn't spoken. There'd only been that look, one full of words they never got to say. And then he'd turned away, leaving her standing in the sunlight with her heart breaking in silence. Later came the rumors that he'd bought land near Dry Creek, that he'd built his own ranch, that he'd remarried. And still, she'd held on to that one memory, his eyes, full of sorrow, not anger. She should have known then a man who looked that lost had not walked away by choice. But in 1869, Wyoming, a woman's voice could be silenced faster than a door could close. Her father had made it clear a Whitmore girl does not chase after a hired hand. So she'd stayed quiet, and her silence became the cruelest mistake of her life. Now, sitting in the kitchen of that same man, the man she'd been told had thrown her away, Ada felt the full weight of what had been stolen from them. The door creaked. Gideon stepped in, his coat damp from the rain, the scent of wet earth clinging to him. "Storm's moving in quicker than I thought," he said, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. Ada folded the letter, pressing it against her palm. But Gideon had already seen it. "You find something." She met his gaze steady, unafraid. This was not a moment for hiding. "It's a letter," she said quietly. "One I wrote you 15 years ago. My father told me you'd come to him, said you wanted to end things, said you thought I wasn't good enough anymore." Gideon froze for a heartbeat. Even the storm outside seemed to stop breathing. Then, slowly, he sat across from her. "I never said that," he murmured, voice hoarse. "Your father came to me. He said you were engaged to some merchant from Denver. He said you'd already chosen a different life." Silence filled the room, thick, heavy, and alive. Ada laid the letter on the table. Her eyes were wet, but her tone was calm. "So we were both deceived." Gideon gave a hollow laugh, one that sounded more like grief than mirth. "Pride and prejudice," he said softly. "We let them make choices for us." Ada shook her head. "No, we let fear do it. Fear of losing our place, of being talked about. We thought silence meant strength." He looked at her, then really looked, and something in his expression began to change. The hardness that had guarded him for years cracked, and through it came something almost like sorrow, or maybe relief. "How long have you carried that?" he asked. 15 years, she said. "I thought you hated me. I tried to move on, but every time I saw smoke from your chimney, I knew I was still waiting even if I didn't admit it." Gideon turned toward the window. The rain was falling now, steady and hard, washing the dust from the porch. "Do you hate me for believing him?" he asked quietly. Ada smiled the kind of smile that comes after years of holding one's breath. "No, Gideon. Hatred's never been the weight I carried. What scared me most wasn't losing you. It was losing faith that people could still be honest with each other. Tonight, I think I've finally found that faith again." He turned back to her. His voice was rough, but there was a new gentleness in it, something raw and real. "Then stay," he said. "Not because of what the town thinks, not out of duty. Stay because we both deserve the truth, and maybe whatever comes after it." Ada's smile deepened. She nodded, slow and certain. Outside, the rain grew heavier, drumming on the roof, carrying away the dust and ashes of everything that had come before. That night, after the storm drifted west toward the granite hills, the sky above Willow Bend turned clear and sharp as glass. The air smelled of rain and clay, and somewhere in the fields, the chirring of crickets stitched the silence back together. Gideon Rowe sat on the porch, a cup of cold coffee in his hands, watching the lantern sway in the soft wind. Inside, Ada Whitmore was mending the torn curtain, her movements slow, steady, like a woman not just sewing fabric, but stitching together two lives that had frayed apart. After a long while, Ada set her needle aside and stepped out to the porch. The lamplight brushed her face, gentle and unhurried. She draped a wool blanket over Gideon's shoulders before sitting down beside him. Not too close, not too far, the quiet distance of two people relearning how to share the same air. "You still drink coffee after supper," she said softly, her gaze drifting toward the open fields. Gideon looked over, surprised. "You remember that I don't just remember," Ada replied, her voice low and even. "I saw it every day for 15 years. He frowned slightly. "You saw it." She nodded, her smile faint as the night breeze. "From the hill road. My house was only half a mile from here. After Father passed, I worked at the general store in town. Each evening, when the day was done, I'd walk out that way pretending to pick wild herbs or gather kindling, but I was just looking toward this porch." The wind lifted a few loose strands of her brown hair. Gideon said nothing. His expression softened, the rough edges of the years melting away. Ada kept her eyes on the horizon as she spoke, the words coming out in a rhythm that felt like breathing. "I saw you out here most nights, with that same tin cup in your hands. In winter, it was ginger tea instead. Every Friday morning. You lit the porch lamp early, must have been the market day in Willow Bend. I noticed when you rebuilt the east stable 3 years back, and when you planted those 2 new rows of willows behind the house. I even remember the morning you buried your old dog. Your hands shook so bad. The shovel slipped 3 times. I was standing on the hill with a handful of wildflowers, but I couldn't make myself come closer." She smiled faintly, not in sadness, but in something softer acceptance. "Maybe I wasn't spying. Gideon, I just needed to know you were all right. I thought, if you'd found peace, then maybe that could be enough for me too." Gideon set his cup down, lacing his hands together. So many words crowded his throat, but none seemed big enough to hold what he felt. The woman sitting beside him, the one he'd once thought had forgotten, had, in truth, been the quiet witness to every passing year of his life. Ada, his voice broke a little. You shouldn't have had to live that way alone like that. Maybe, she said, calm as dusk, but it was my choice. In town, they called me the Whitmore spinster. At first it hurt, then it didn't. I got used to it. But every time I saw the smoke from your chimney rise at dusk, I felt warm. It reminded me that once I'd loved someone good, and that was enough to keep me going. Gideon blinked back tears. He looked out over the fields dark, endless, and full of ghosts. I don't know what to say that could make up for all that time. Ada shook her head gently. There's nothing to make up for. I didn't come back asking for anything. I came because I needed to stop watching from a distance. 15 years is long enough to love someone from afar. Maybe God grew tired of my waiting and decided to throw me right at your doorstep. She laughed softly, then a sound both rueful and thankful. If it weren't for that cruel little joke they played, I'd probably still be standing on that same hill, watching your chimney smoke another 15 years. Gideon let out a quiet breath, his eyes glistening. You know, sometimes I thought I felt it that someone was out there. Every evening, walking the fence line, I'd catch that sense of being watched. Not in a bad way, more like someone was hoping I'd look back. I thought it was just in my head. Guess I was right after all. Maybe people can sense each other, Ada said softly, even after the world tries to keep them apart. They fell silent. The crickets sang louder, and the old wood of the porch creaked beneath their feet. The night hung between them like an old hymn worn, familiar, and sacred in its stillness. Ada, Gideon said at last, eyes still on the dark horizon. I don't know if there's time left to make things right, but if you've come this far, I don't ever want you to have to leave again. She turned to him, her gaze steady but kind. I didn't come to be kept, Gideon. I came to finally look at what I've been watching all these years and to find peace in it. For the first time in a long while, I think I have. Gideon nodded slowly. A quiet, bittersweet relief rose inside him, the kind that feels like a hymn sung too late, but sung all the same. Thank you, he whispered, for remembering me. Ada smiled, a smile that belonged to both the girl she once was and the woman she had become. I didn't just remember, she said. I never stopped believing that somewhere inside you, there was still a place where I belonged. The wind stirred again, carrying the scent of hay and rain. Two silhouettes sat side by side beneath the porch light. No promises, no confessions, no need to fix what time had already healed in its own way. Just presence, just truth. And somewhere in that silence, love found its way back quiet, steadfast, and utterly alive. Morning laid a thin veil of mist across the fields. The first sunlight just brushed the red roof of Rowe Ranch when Ada Whitmore scattered corn for the hens. From far off, the rhythm of hooves began steady, heavy, the kind of sound that turns peace into a warning. Ada looked up, narrowed her eyes through the haze, and saw 4, maybe 5 riders cutting across the flats. At their head rode Martin Brennan, the Willow Bend bank manager, with a couple of his junior men, the kind who loved a story more than they loved the truth. They reined in at the gate, iron shoes thudding on wet earth. Brennan, all dark mustache and practiced smirk, glanced toward the porch where Gideon Rowe stepped out, shirt half-buttoned, hair still damp from a quick wash. "Well now," Brennan drawled, "you're looking cheerful. Rowe, word is, the town sent you a surprise last night. We just rode over to see whether the gift suits your operation." A few of his men snorted. One cut a look at Ada, scraping mud from his boot. "Not bad," he muttered, just loud enough. "For an old maid, she looks sturdy enough to handle a cook fire." Ada didn't answer. She wiped her palms on her apron, straightened, and let the stillness in her eyes speak first. Gideon gripped the porch rail, the tendons rippling along his wrist, before the anger rose any higher. Ada stepped beside him and set a steadying hand on his arm. "Don't," she whispered soft, but steel-lined. "They came hoping to see you rage. Give them what they want, but on our terms." Gideon's gaze cooled. The blaze banked down to coals. He nodded. Ada descended the 3 steps and stood in the open yard. The morning wind lifted her skirt's hem, and in that washed-out light she looked like a boundary stake planted against the storm. "Good morning, Mr. Brennan," she said, level and calm. "You're early. If you've come for the ending to a joke, you'll be disappointed. The woman dropped at this gate is no punchline. She's a woman who works and a woman who keeps her own respect." Brennan's smile thinned. "Respect. The whole town had a laugh last night. They're calling you Rowe's new burden. And as the man responsible for a note he's not paying down as quickly as he should, well, I take an interest in any burden that distracts him." Gideon stepped down to stand with Ada. When he spoke, his voice was low, each word hammered straight. "That note's being paid on schedule. Brennan, and even if it weren't, you don't ride onto my land to insult a guest." Brennan laughed a slick sound, like a dull knife pushed through wet wood. "Guest word is she was delivered here, not invited. Call her what you like. Rowe, men who care about their good name should choose their company with care." Ada laid a light hand on Gideon's sleeve, a small shake of her head that said, "Let me." "Mr. Brennan," she said, "you're right about one thing. People saw what they wanted to see last night. But the town only looks at a face. It seldom reads the ledger. If I'm not mistaken, your bank considered selling the lowland parcels along Dry Creek to the railroad. If that happens, this ranch and this town becomes nothing but carved strips of right-of-way." Brennan's jaw set. He sniffed, trying to turn contempt into dignity. "You know a lot for a woman who just stepped out of a kitchen." "I kept books at the general store," Ada replied, voice quiet, words clean. "Numbers don't care who reads them, and I know a railroad tries to buy cheap by pushing landowners into debt, and the quickest way to push a man is to shame him in public." Brennan's men glanced at one another. One looked down. Gideon said nothing surprised. Yes, but steady with a rising private pride. This woman wasn't shielding him with temper. She was shielding him with facts. Ada took a single step closer, not threatening, simply refusing to be smaller. "If you rode here for a show, ride back and tell them this: the woman dumped at Rowe Ranch is making breakfast for a working outfit, and the man who runs it is still working. If you rode here to shake a bank manager's stick, choose another target. Rowe Ranch doesn't stand alone anymore." Gideon looked over at her. "Ada," he began, but she caught his eyes and smiled, gentle and immovable. "We let other people write the first part of our story. Gideon," she said, "from here on, we write the rest." Silence took the yard. Brennan worked his reins, lips tight around a half-made smile. I'll remember that. Miss Whitmore, he said, pitching the words like a promise. We'll be in touch. He flicked his wrist, and the little procession wheeled as one. Hooves clattered, dust rose like a curtain, and then the men were only a smear on the pale road. When the last echo faded, Gideon let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He kept staring down the rutted track, as if a second version of himself might still be standing there, the version who'd shouted and given them what they paid to see. "You didn't have to do that," he said at last. "I didn't do it for you," Ada said. "I did it because I won't let men turn someone's dignity into entertainment. Not yours, not mine, not anyone's." A new breeze swept the yard, spinning flecks of dust in the sun. Gideon looked at her, not the way a starving man looks at bread, but the way a weary man recognizes a companion who can walk as far as he can. Respect, trust, the beginnings of something that could hold. He cleared his throat, suddenly shy in his own yard. "About that note," he said, "it is current, but Brennan's not wrong about pressure. He wants the lowland sold cheap. There's talk in town money men at the hotel, letters from Cheyenne. They want a rail spur and they want it fast." Ada nodded, listening like a partner, not a spectator. "Then we make speed on our side," she said. "Work clean, pay on time, keep records anyone can read, and if they try the shame game again, we won't shout, we'll show." Gideon's mouth lifted at one corner. "Show what that this place is exactly what it looks like," Ada said. "A working ranch with two steady hands on the line." For a second he forgot to blink. 2 steady hands. He'd run this land for years with only his own, and the wind had taught him the cost. Now, all at once, the word two felt like rain after months of dust. He turned toward the corral, watching the horses nose at the rails. "You sure about two?" he asked quietly. Not quite a question, not quite a prayer. Ada didn't rush the space between them. "I'm sure about the day in front of us," she said. "Tomorrow we'll answer again." They stood like that a moment longer, not touching, not declaring, only agreeing to keep their backs straight in the same direction. From the kitchen, the first crackle of bacon reached the yard. Ada brushed her hands on her apron. "Breakfast is nearly ready," she said. "If Brennan rides back into town hungry for gossip, let him leave hungry." Gideon huffed a laugh short. Surprised, good. "He'll choke on it either way," he said. "Then we won't feed him," Ada answered, turning toward the door. He watched her go, the purposeful set of her shoulders, the quiet economy of each step. The ranch had weathered drought, blight, winter kill. It would weather men like Brennan, too, especially now. The frontier sun leaned heavy on the red-tiled roof of Rowe Ranch, spilling gold across the yard and tracing slow beams through the porch slats. The wind carried the scent of dry grass and fresh coffee. Ada Whitmore stood in the doorway holding a wooden tray, 2 steaming cups, thin curls of vapor rising like quiet prayers. Gideon Rowe sat on the step, his gaze still fixed on the road where, hours earlier, the mockers had ridden off in a cloud of dust. They didn't speak. Silence lay between them, not the uneasy silence of strangers, but the kind that comes after a storm, when there's nothing left to prove. Ada set the tray down beside him. "They'll be back," she said softly, her eyes on the horizon. "Brennan doesn't let go easy. Next time, they'll come looking for something new to gossip about." Gideon's mouth twisted, half a smirk, half a wince. "You want me to give them a show?" play the love-struck fool who fell for the burden they dumped at his gate. Ada shook her head. No, I want us to show them neither of us is a burden at all. She looked out over the pasture. The light caught her hair brown, turning to copper where the sun touched it. If they want a performance, we'll give them one, she added quietly, but it'll be ours, not theirs. Something in Gideon shifted. The woman before him was no longer the quiet girl he once knew. Time had carved steadiness into her. She met cruelty with composure, gossip with grace. He felt it admiration first, then something deeper, almost dangerous. That afternoon, as if summoned by Ada's foresight, riders appeared again. They claimed to be just passing through, but everyone knew better. Brennan led them, astride his black gelding, wearing that banker's grin that never reached his eyes. Gideon waited on the porch, his shirt clean, sleeves rolled. Ada joined him, calm as morning dew, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. Brennan reined in near the gate, pretending surprise. Well, look at that. Seems Rowe Ranch's hospitality extends to long-term guests. A ripple of laughter passed through the men. One elbowed another and called up, "Looks like a fine match after all. Maybe we'll be hearing wedding bells." Brennan nodded mockingly. Didn't take long for the hermit of Willow Bend to come around. Ada smiled, not forced, not cold, just enough to turn the sting back on them. People do change quicker when someone around them knows when to hold their tongue. Mr. Brennan. The laughter faltered. Before the men could recover, Ada stepped closer to Gideon, close enough that their shoulders brushed. She turned her face slightly toward his, voice barely above a breath. "They came for a show," she whispered. "Let's give them one." Gideon hesitated. Then something steadied inside him. He reached for her hand, slow and sure, feeling the tremor of life beneath her skin, and before he could second-guess it, he raised her hand and kissed it, a simple gesture. Yet it filled the air like thunder after drought. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Even the horses stilled. Brennan's grin died halfway across his face. Gideon straightened, his voice calm as stone. "Mr. Brennan," he said, "in this territory, a man doesn't ride onto another man's land to insult a lady, not if he plans on being welcome again." Ada's smile deepened, quiet and unyielding. "And few men," she added, "would make the trip twice just to find out the story doesn't end the way they expected." A gust swept across the yard, lifting the curtain behind them. Ada's hair caught the light. Her eyes, when they met Gideon's, held something real. The performance had slipped its mask. That kiss light as it was had broken something open. It wasn't pretense anymore. It was a truth long buried, spoken without words. The men shifted uneasily. Someone cleared his throat. Then, one by one, they turned their horses. Brennan lingered, his pride fighting with his reason, then jerked the reins hard. Dust rose again, and they were gone. When the last echo faded, Ada exhaled. She meant to pull her hand away, but Gideon's fingers stayed there, gentle, but firm. "You handled them better than I ever could," he said quietly. "I've seen Brennan silenced by money, by law, but never by words." Ada's eyes softened, though her tone stayed even. "We didn't win, Gideon. We just stopped giving them what they came for." "Maybe," he murmured, "but I'm not sure what was acting anymore." She didn't answer. The breeze played with the edge of her apron. Somewhere a hawk cried, and the world settled again into the rhythm of cicadas and rustling grass. Finally, she spoke, barely audible. "If you'd looked at me like that all those years ago, I might never have left." The words struck him like the sound of a gate closing, not bitter, just final. Gideon said nothing. He only watched her turn toward the door, the sunlight drawing a faint halo around her as she disappeared inside. The porch smelled of coffee, sawdust, and something new, fragile, uncertain, but alive. That evening, under a pale wash of moonlight, Gideon sat again where the day had begun, the same porch, the same quiet road, now cloaked in silver dust. Brennan's laughter still echoed faintly in his mind, and for the first time he heard it differently. Beneath the mockery had been intent, not just spite, but strategy. He felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. When Ada came out with the lantern, she saw the tension in his jaw. "You're thinking of him," she said. He nodded slowly. There was something in his tone. This isn't just about pride or gossip. He's after something: land, money, maybe both, and whatever it is, he won't stop here. Ada set the lantern on the rail. The flame swayed, catching the worry in both their eyes. "Then we'll be ready," she said quietly. "Whatever game Brennan's playing, he'll find out we're not pieces to be moved." They stood side by side, the lamplight casting twin shadows across the porch. Two people who had learned, finally, that the truest performance isn't for the world's applause, but for the quiet promise they make to themselves. The moon stretched thin and pale over Willow Bend, silvering the tips of the willow trees and painting long, uneven shadows across the roof of Rowe Ranch. The night was quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of silence that lets you hear your own heart beat. Only the churring of crickets and the restless wind through the shutters broke the stillness. Inside, Gideon Rowe sat at the kitchen table. A wrinkled contract lay before him, the ink smeared in one corner like a wound that refused to close. His pen lay broken beside it. The lamplight made his features hard, the lines at his eyes deeper. When Ada Whitmore entered, carrying a small oil lamp, the soft glow caught the worry etched across his face. "I know, Ada," he said without looking up. "I know what Brennan's been planning." She set the lamp down, the flame trembling between them. "Tell me." He exhaled, gaze fixed on the moonlit window. When they rode off today, he circled back just him. Said the bank might reconsider my loan if my domestic situation changed. His voice tightened. He said a married man spends more, works less, loses standing with other men. He said once I take a wife, the ranch will slip from my hands piece by piece. Then he laughed, told me I'd sign the southern acreage to the railroad before winter. Ada's brow furrowed. So that's it. The whole charade, every whisper in town was bait. Gideon nodded slowly. They wanted to make me the fool, break my reputation, turn this ranch into collateral for their deals. Brennan's playing both sides, the bank and the railroad. Ada smiled faintly, but there was no humor in it. It's almost poetic, isn't it? They think affection makes a man weak. He finally looked up, the lamplight flickering across his eyes. "They don't know you," he said quietly. "They don't know that you're the reason I've stood taller these past days than I have in years." The words hung there simple, unadorned, but true. Ada lowered her gaze to the crumpled paper. The heading still showed through the ink blot: proposal for Central Wyoming Rail Development. "I've heard the rumors," she said. "Brennan's been in talks with a company out of Denver. They've been buying farmland cheap, pushing owners into debt, then swooping in with contracts. One of the shopkeepers told me Brennan said, let him have a woman in his house. Sooner or later, he'll sell. Gideon's fists clenched on the table. He thinks I've already fallen into that trap. Ada stepped closer to the window, her figure haloed by moonlight. He forgets that I grew up in my father's land office. I've watched men like Brennan my whole life, men who think they can outtalk the land itself. They always forget the soil remembers who's tended it. When she turned back, her eyes had lost all trace of weariness. If he wants to see what kind of burden I am, she said, then he'll learn that this burden knows how to count, how to invest, and how to strike back. Gideon blinked, half in awe. Ada, what are you thinking I have savings? She replied, after my father died, I sold the general store. Brennan doesn't know I keep my money in Montana. If I invest it here, under my own name, the law can't touch this ranch the way he plans. Wyoming passed the Married Women's Property Act last year. He can't use me against you, not if I own my share outright. For a long moment, Gideon didn't speak. He looked at her as though seeing her for the first time not as a ghost from his past, but as the living, breathing equal he hadn't known he'd been waiting for. "You'd do that?" he asked. "I'm not afraid of Brennan," Ada said simply. "I'm afraid of watching someone like you give up what's rightfully yours because of their corruption. You've built this land with your hands. Gideon, I won't let them take it from you with ink." He rose from his chair, every movement heavy with feeling. The air between them shifted half gratitude, half something more dangerous and more human. "Ada, I don't know how to thank you, but I can't let you carry my burden." She met his eyes, unwavering. "When I walked through that gate, I stopped caring what they said about me. It's not about names or shame anymore. It's about truth. And the truth is, they fear you. Gideon, fear what a man of integrity can do when he refuses to sell his soul." Their eyes locked. The lamp flickered. The world outside shrank until only the two of them remained two hearts, steady against the hum of the wind. When Ada stepped out to the porch, the night had grown colder. The scent of dry hay mingled with the faraway hint of rain. Gideon followed, standing beside her. Below, the valley lights of Willow Bend blinked like watchful eyes. "They're waiting for me to fail," he said quietly. "Then don't." Ada answered, her voice steady. "Tomorrow we start again, but this time, not alone." The wind moved through the willows like a sigh, and for the first time in years, Gideon felt something stronger than fear-faith. Morning broke over Rowe Ranch with a wash of gold, sunlight spilling through the narrow kitchen window and warming the pine-wood walls. The smell of coffee mingled with the faint sweetness of drying hay, a scent that belonged only to frontier mornings, where each day began not with luxury, but with endurance, hope, and a quiet readiness to fight whatever might come. Ada Whitmore stood before the mirror, twisting her hair into a neat coil. Gone was the work apron and dust-stained skirt. This morning she wore a simple gray dress, modest but firm in its tailoring, with black ribbons at her wrists. On the table beside her lay a single document, the certified investment deed from the Willow Bend Law Office, its red seal catching the light, resting atop a worn leather satchel filled with receipts, sale records, and letters of transfer. Outside on the porch, Gideon Rowe waited. His shirt was crisp, but his boots still held yesterday's dust. He turned as she stepped out. holding the same paper he'd read over and over through the night. "Ada," he said quietly, "are you certain about this Brennan's not the sort to forgive? Once he learns you sold everything your father left you just to stake it here, he'll come for blood." Ada smiled faintly, her tone steady as sunrise. "Let him. I didn't do this to keep him quiet. I did it so he'd finally understand I didn't come here to seek shelter. I came to build something beside you, as an equal, not as a burden." Gideon studied her for a long moment, and in her calm he saw not defiance, but dignity, the kind born from years of being underestimated. She wasn't just standing up for him, she was reclaiming herself. By late morning, the silence of Dry Creek was broken by the thunder of hooves. A plume of dust rose from the road as Brennan arrived with 3 men, their dark suits jarring against the open land. "Mornin'," Rowe Brennan called, his grin too wide to be friendly. "I hope you've had time to think about my offer." Gideon stood tall on the porch, arms resting lightly on the railing. "I have," he said evenly, "and I've come to a decision." The banker's grin widened, but before he could speak, Ada stepped forward. The sun caught the sheen of her brown hair, turning it the color of burnished copper. In her hands, tied neatly with red string, was a stack of legal papers. "Mr. Brennan," she said softly, "if your concern is the financial state of Rowe Ranch, you may direct your questions to me from now on." A ripple of surprise moved through the men. Brennan's smile faltered. "What in God's name are you talking about?" Ada untied the ribbon, placing the papers on the porch table so that the bright seal from the law office glinted in full view. "I sold my father's house on Main Street, and the general store that came with it. Every cent of it's now invested here, through the Montana Bank. As of this morning, I'm the legal co-owner of Rowe Ranch, for a heartbeat." The world went still. Even the horses seemed to stop breathing. Brennan's face flushed dark red, his composure cracking. "You're out of your mind," he hissed. "You've thrown away your inheritance for a rancher with nothing left to lose. You think that makes you respectable." Ada smiled again, a small, unshakable smile that held the edge of iron beneath its warmth. "Respect doesn't come from gossip, Mr. Brennan. It comes from keeping one's word and one's work, something I doubt you'd understand." She stepped closer, a voice still calm but carrying the weight of quiet authority. "And since you brought up business as co-owner, I now have the right to review every transaction between your bank and this ranch, including the interest rates you've been inflating. If I find even one irregularity, I'll have it before the town council by week's end." The color drained from Brennan's face. He took one sharp step forward, but Gideon moved between them. "You heard her," he said. "Your game's done. You thought you could turn this place into a joke, but you forgot something Rowe Ranch doesn't bend." A gust of wind swept through the yard, carrying the scent of sage and dust. Ada's skirt fluttered, but her stance didn't waver. Brennan's mouth twisted into a bitter grin. "You think you've beaten me, Miss Whitmore. You've tied yourself to a man who's nearly broke. Don't pretend you've won anything." Ada's reply was quiet, almost kind. "I didn't bet on a man. Mr. Brennan, I invested in the truth, and that's something your kind never manages to keep." Brennan had no answer. He yanked the reins of his horse, jaw tight with fury, and rode off with his men trailing behind a cloud of dust, rising where their pride had fallen. When the road fell silent again, Gideon turned to Ada. Words hovered on his lips, but she lifted a hand gently. "No thanks," she said softly. "I didn't do this to save you. I did it because it's the only way I know how to stay free." Gideon's gaze softened, his voice low. "Ada, I'll remember what you did today for as long as I live. You faced him down, and I swear, I've never seen anything like it." She smiled, looking out over the fields turning gold in the noon light. "You forget." "Gideon," she said, her tone teasing but proud. "I was raised on land where women learn to stand their ground when the wind changes." The sound of the ranch returned the cluck of hens, the creak of the porch, the distant call of a hawk overhead. It felt different now, stronger, freer. The late afternoon sun stretched low across the plains of Willow Bend, turning the world to gold. The last light spilled over the rolling hills and caught the shimmer of Dry Creek, where the water glided smooth and silver under a sky brushed with fire. The storm that had raged the night before was gone now, leaving behind the scent of rain and clean earth, that quiet stillness that only comes after a hard fight. Ada Whitmore walked toward the creek, her skirt brushing against wild sage. Each step felt like memory heavy and soft at once. Behind her came the steady sound of hooves Gideon Rowe's gray stallion, moving at an easy, unhurried pace. When he reached her, Gideon dismounted and stood beside her. The water gurgled between them, and the lowering sun set his profile in bronze and shadow. For a long time, neither spoke. The only sound was the creek's low murmur and the rustle of wind through the dry grass. Ada knelt, scooping a handful of cold water, letting it run through her fingers like sand. "I used to come here every day," she said softly. "Back when I was too scared to walk through your gate, I thought if I waited long enough, maybe the wind would carry your answer to me." Gideon's smile came slow, tinged with regret. "And every time I rode past this creek, I felt like a fool believing what people said instead of what I knew in my heart. Seems we were both waiting, Ada, just on opposite sides of the same lie." She looked up at him then. For a heartbeat, the world held still. Words felt unnecessary. Every truth they'd avoided was already there in the silence between them. A soft wind stirred, brushing her hair across her cheek. She looked across the creek, that invisible line that had once divided past and present, then turned back. "I made myself a promise," she said quietly, "that if I ever got another chance, I'd never let anyone else speak for me again." Gideon's gaze was steady, gentle, but searching. "And now you're here. No one between us. What is it you want to say?" Ada drew a long breath. "That I didn't come back to fight Brennan or to save this ranch. I came because I never stopped thinking about you, and if there's any way for us to cross what we lost, I want to try even just once." Gideon didn't move for several seconds. Then, slowly, he reached out, resting his hand on her shoulder. The touch was light, reverent, as if he feared breaking something too precious. "Ada," he said, voice low, 15 years ago, I let pride destroy the best thing I ever had. Now that you're here, I won't make that mistake again." And as the sun slipped below the ridge, he leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't the eager kiss of youth, but the kind that carried the weight of years gentle, certain, and full of understanding. Ada trembled slightly, but she didn't pull away. Her hand found his chest, resting there, feeling the steady rhythm beneath. "What will you do about Brennan?" she whispered. "Not just Brennan," Gideon said, The men behind him, too. They think this marriage talk will make me weaker, distracted. But I'm done playing their game. I mean, to make it real." She frowned, unsure. "What do you mean?" He took her hand, roughened from work, and held it as if sealing a pact. "Ada, marry me." Her eyes widened. "Gideon, what did you say, marry me? For real? If we're wed, your co-ownership becomes permanent. The land can't be split or forced into sale." "But Ada," his voice dropped to a rough whisper, "I'm not asking out of strategy. I'm asking because I can't imagine another day without you here." Ada's breath caught. The sun had almost vanished now, leaving a wash of copper across the sky. "Are you sure?" she asked softly. "They'll say I did it for the land, for convenience." "Let them talk," he said. "As long as we know the truth." A long pause hung between them, filled only by the sound of the water. Ada's eyes searched his and saw nothing but conviction. "If I say yes," she murmured, "there's no turning back. I don't plan to." She smiled, a small, trembling smile that steadied as she spoke. "Then yes." Gideon exhaled, something like relief and awe mingling in his expression. He drew her close, pressing her hand to his heart. Around them, the wind rose, scattering the wildflower petals that had bloomed after the rain. There were no rings, no witnesses, only the quiet promise of two people who'd learned the price of waiting too long. When they returned to Rowe Ranch, twilight had deepened to violet. Ada stood on the porch, looking westward, the sky melting into indigo. Gideon joined her, a folded piece of paper in his hand, a handwritten marriage certificate, provisional, stamped by the town clerk's office. "I'll take you down to Willow Bend in the morning," he said. "We'll have it filed proper." Ada chuckled, eyes glinting with humor. A proposal both romantic and practical. "Only you, Gideon." He smiled back. "I learned from you, Ada, that love isn't a dream. It's something that has to stand on its own 2 feet." By late afternoon, the wind had shifted. Dark clouds gathered over the Medicine Bow Range, and the last light of day stretched long and thin across the fields of Willow Bend. The air around Rowe Ranch was heavy and strange, too still, too quiet. Even the barn doors creaked differently, as if the wood itself sensed what was coming. Gideon Rowe set down his coffee, listening. Then came the sound, the pounding rhythm of hooves tearing through the dirt road. Before he could reach the door, a young rider burst through the front gate, his horse gasping, coat spattered with dust. It was Danny Harris, the ranch hand's boy, wide-eyed, breathless. "Mr. Rowe, Miss Whitmore," he shouted, voice breaking. "They're coming, Brennan and his men. They mean to burn the ranch tonight. I heard 'em at the saloon. They'll ride when the moon's up." Ada and Gideon locked eyes. No one spoke. They didn't have to. The quiet between them said it all. The fight they'd been waiting for had finally found them. Gideon rose, calm but resolute. "Danny, you've done right coming here. Now listen carefully. Ride back to town. Find Sheriff Wade. Tell him to bring men here as fast as he can." He tore a page from his notebook, scribbled a few lines, signed, and sealed it. "Take this to the Willow Bend telegraph office," he said, handing over the note. "Send it straight to Wyoming Central Railway headquarters. They need to know Brennan's crossed the line." Danny hesitated, fear flickering in his eyes. "But, sir, if they find out I told Ada, step forward," her voice steady and kind. "Danny, sometimes telling the truth is the only way to save yourself from the shame of silence later." He met her gaze, young, frightened, but Trustin then nodded sharply. Yes, ma'am, and with a tug on the reins, he was gone, his horse disappearing into the oncoming dusk. By the time the last streaks of daylight faded, the world had turned to ash gray. Gideon moved through the yard, checking each stable door, oiling the hinges on the rifle, making sure every exit was clear. Ada packed the ledgers, deeds, and their new partnership papers into a wooden chest near the door. "You really think they'll do it?" she asked quietly. "Brennan's desperate," Gideon replied. "He's lost the council, lost his deal with the railroad. Men like him, when they're cornered, stop caring who burns with them." Ada nodded, tightening the wool scarf around her neck. The wind came sharp and cold, carrying the faintest scent of oil and smoke, not fire yet, but the kind that warns of it. Somewhere far off, a lamp had been lit, a signal, perhaps, a threat made real. Night fell. The moon rose thin, curved, and pale as a blade. From the hills came the steady drum of hooves. Ada gripped the window frame, eyes scanning the dark. "They're here," Gideon murmured, cocking his Winchester. A voice rang out across the yard, loud, mocking, and slurred with whiskey. "Rowe, you still awake?" It was Brennan. "Heard you're getting married. Thought we'd stop by, bring a little fire to celebrate." A shadow lifted a torch. Ada gasped. "Gideon." He fired a warning shot skyward. The crack split the silence, echoing through the valley. The horses reared and screamed. Brennan cursed and waved his men forward, but before they could move, a second sound rose over the plains, the ring of spurs, the clatter of more horses, and the gleam of lanterns. Sheriff Wade arrived with 2 deputies and a handful of townsmen. "Brennan," the sheriff thundered, "drop it. You're under arrest for attempted arson, extortion, and conspiracy to commit murder." For a moment, Brennan just stared, stunned. Then another rider appeared behind the sheriff, Danny Harris, holding a telegraph stamped with the railway seal. Sheriff Wade raised the paper high. "The Wyoming Central has terminated all contracts with Brennan Bank. They've opened a formal investigation into fraud and land theft." The words hit like a bullet. The men behind Brennan shifted, uncertain. One dropped his torch into the dirt. The flame sputtered out with a hiss. Ada stepped forward, her posture calm, voice clear as a bell. "Mr. Brennan," she said, "do you remember calling me a burden tonight? That burden saved your life. You'd have hung for murder if the fire had caught." He couldn't meet her eyes. His head hung low as Wade bound his wrists. Then the sheriff swung into his saddle and led the defeated banker toward town. The rest of the men followed, heads bowed, their shadows fading into the dark. When the noise finally died away, silence returned, not empty this time, but peaceful. Gideon turned down the lamp, joining Ada on the porch. The rain came soft and thin, tapping the roof like a lullaby. "If it weren't for Danny," he began. "If it weren't for you," Ada interrupted gently, "there'd be nothing worth saving." They stood side by side, watching the faint light of Willow Bend shimmer on the horizon. Not bright, but steady, like hope itself. Spring came to Willow Bend like a quiet rebirth. The long winter had melted away, leaving the valley bright and breathing again. Along the dirt road that climbed the eastern hill, where the little pinewood chapel of St. Helena stood, wildflowers had been tied to the fences, bunches of lavender and yellow daisies swaying gently in the breeze. The air carried their scent, mingling with the slow, tender tolling of the church bell, the rhythm of a new beginning. 3 weeks had passed since the night of smoke and fire. Brennan was now in custody, awaiting trial in Cheyenne. Rowe Ranch, though scarred, still stood proud against the horizon. After receiving Gideon's telegram, the Wyoming Central Railway had sent a team of investigators, and this time they arrived not with demands, but with a fair contract. The land Gideon chose to sell would be paid at full value, and the rest remained under joint ownership of Mr. and Mrs. Rowe Gideon and Ada Whitmore Rowe. Their wedding was not grand. There were no strings, no choir, no spectacle, only the people who mattered. A handful of townsfolk, Sheriff Wade and young Danny Harris, sitting tall in the front pew, hat clutched to his chest. Ada wore a simple cream dress, no lace, no veil, only a small wildflower tucked behind her ear. When she stepped into the chapel, Gideon was already waiting at the end of the aisle. The hard lines of his face, once shadowed by solitude, had softened. For the first time in years, his eyes looked at peace. When the preacher spoke the blessing, a soft gust from the prairie slipped through the open window, lifting Ada's hair, stirring the curtains like wings. She met Gideon's gaze, and in that gaze was home. There were no golden rings, only a silver bracelet Ada had worn since her youth. She took it off and placed it in his hand. "It's not worth much," she said, voice trembling, "but I kept it all these years as a reminder that some things only make sense when the right person comes along." Gideon closed his fingers around it, then pressed a kiss to her forehead. "I made you wait too long," he murmured. "But if life's a journey, Ada, I've finally reached where I was meant to be." The bell rang again. Applause rippled through the chapel. Danny blew a shrill, joyful note on his whistle, and Sheriff Wade chuckled from the back. "Well," the sheriff said, grinning, "I reckon Brennan's going to be so mad he'll forget what sunlight looks like." Laughter followed, warm and easy, the kind that heals old wounds. That evening, after the small celebration, they returned to Rowe Ranch. The wooden gate carved with the initials R swung open, its hinges creaking like an old friend clearing its throat. The horses grazed quietly in the field, and far off, the sunset flared red against the mountains. Ada paused on the porch, gazing at the house once a symbol of loneliness, now reborn as something gentler. Gideon came beside her, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "The railway men will be here tomorrow," he said. "They want to build a small depot 2 miles south. In exchange, they'll open a freight route for the ranchers nearby." What do you think? Ada smiled, her eyes following the fading light. "I think if they come in good faith, that's a start. Maybe it's time this frontier learned to bargain with fairness instead of power." Gideon nodded. He handed her a cup, and they sat together on the steps. The evening air was cool, fragrant with the earth after rain. "Do you ever wonder," Ada asked softly, "what would have happened if my father hadn't forbidden us back then?" "Maybe things would have been easier," Gideon said, staring out at the horizon. "But then we might never have learned what forgiveness feels like, or that real love isn't just the sweet seasons, but the choice to stay after the storms." Ada turned toward him, her smile tinged with tenderness. "And maybe that's why you're the only man I'd ever want beside me in every season." That night, Ada couldn't sleep. The ranch was quiet, the moonlight silvering the window frame. She sat by the glass, watching the fields shimmer under the stars. It wasn't that she'd forgotten the years of silence and scorn, the whispers of old Maid, the cruel laughter, the pitying eyes. She remembered them all, but now they no longer cut. Somewhere between surviving and forgiving, she had learned to let go not by forgetting, but by understanding that the pain had been part of the path that brought her here. She turned to look at Gideon asleep beside her, his breathing slow, his hand resting lightly on the blanket. The house no longer felt empty. It felt earned. Placing a hand over her heart, she whispered, "Sometimes God doesn't give us what we want right away because He wants us strong enough to cherish it when it finally arrives." Years later, folks in Willow Bend still told the story of Ada and Gideon Rowe. They called it a legend, the tale of a spinster once sent off as a cruel joke, who became the heart of the valley. But to those who knew them, it wasn't a legend at all. It was just two people who chose decency over pride, who built something lasting in a place where so little ever lasted. The Rowe Ranch thrived. The small depot was built. Travelers passing through Dry Creek would sometimes pause at the fence line, looking toward the house with the windmill and the wildflowers, and they'd say, "That's where the old story happened." And if the evening was still enough, they might swear they could hear the faint sound of laughter from the porch, the laughter of two souls who had learned that love, when it's real, doesn't need to be loud to endure. The story they forced the old maid on the rancher. She became the only woman he loved isn't just a Western love tale. It's a heartfelt reminder of the strength that comes from self-respect, patience, and faith in one's own worth. Ada Whitmore once mocked as the old maid refused to let cruel words define her. She chose to stand tall, to love bravely, and to live with dignity. And in doing so, she helped Gideon Rowe, a man once haunted by regret, rediscover that true love isn't measured by youth, beauty, or the past, but by the courage to stay when the world walks away. Across that dry, unforgiving land, they prove something simple yet eternal. Happiness doesn't come from pity, it comes from choice. Though their story took place more than a century ago, its truth still echoes today, because at some point, each of us has been judged, misunderstood, or forced to rise again to prove that we are worthy of love, respect, and a second chance. If you believe that kindness and genuine love still have a place in this world, help us keep that flame alive. Like, share, and subscribe to Frontier Hearts so we can continue bringing you stories that remind us all, even in a world full of storms, there is still grace, courage, and quiet redemption. Because sometimes, all it takes is one story told at the right moment to make us believe again that love, no matter how late it arrives, always finds its way home.